Hi, and welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this show, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And we're going to be talking a lot about politics, energy, and power, both electrical power and political power, with my guest, Jennifer Hernandez, a lawyer for the 200. Jennifer, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here again.
So my custom is, and I didn't warn you about this ahead of time, is that I like to have my guests introduce themselves. I know you have a distinguished legal career, but if you don't mind, can you get 30 or 45 seconds? Imagine you've just arrived at a dinner party, you don't know anyone, and you're asked to introduce yourself. Go.
Well, the thing I think that folks should know is I grew up in Pittsburgh, California, which is a decidedly working class factory town. Of U.S. Steel and Dow Chemical and PG&E and Union Carbide and John Manville and Fiberboard, American brand names in California on the shores of the Delta. And I grew up in a polluted factory town, and I'm pretty passionate about pollution. And I was zoomed out like on a magic carpet ride in high school, having never been east of Lake Tahoe in Nevada, to Harvard, where I received a full freight scholarship, which was astonishing and included even winter clothes, and then came back to Stanford Law School with a similarly generous financial aid package. So Hernandez is my name, and I'm pretty passionate about protecting working class, hardworking people in California who seem to slip behind every single day under the current policies we're implementing. So that's me.
Well, that's a great introduction and a perfect setup, because I was going to ask you about your hometown. But let's jump to why I wanted to have you on the show. And by the way, I should mention, earlier this year, you were recognized by Daily Journal as one of the top 100 lawyers in California. And you're also a partner at Holland Knight, which is a large law firm based in San Francisco, or is it based in LA?
It's actually all over the country. It was founded in Florida.
Founded in Florida. Okay. All right. So the reason I wanted to have you on is the litigation that now you have pending against the state of California. As I recall, you have 3 different lawsuits, but all are in one way or another aimed at California's energy and climate policies. Can you run us through quickly those lawsuits and why you filed them? The first one was filed April of 2018, I believe.
That's right.
And then you've since filed 2 more. What are those lawsuits, and why do they matter now?
Sure. So Californians generally are extremely fond of our environment. It's one of the reasons that California is great. We have a lovely climate, a lovely natural setting. We're pretty great about fighting pollution and making inroads into technology innovations that, for example, have allowed cars to be about 98% cleaner over the last 40 years than they were in 1969. So, I'm pretty passionate about the environment for sure. But the twin California that folks don't like to talk about as much, especially in environmental circles, is our poverty problem. And it's not just the homeless. The homeless are the tip of the spear, only the most visible sign of people struggling. In fact, California has the highest poverty rate in the country when you take housing into account. And taking housing into account is really taking the combined policies of Californians over the last 30 or 40 years, which have resulted in this massive housing shortage. And the housing shortage, again, if you just look at the tip of the spear, we see some incredible, billionaire estate type things. But what's completely disappeared is attainable home ownership for median income families. And that's not luxurious.
And if I can interrupt, the housing shortage, the latest numbers I'd seen is that estimates are now, even today, a shortage of roughly 2 or 3 million units in the
That's
state.
right.
In the state today.
That's right. We have fewer housing units per household, fewer than any state in the country except for Utah, which has larger family sizes by a good margin.
If I don't mind me interrupting, I saw one other point that one of the graphics in, I think it's your lawsuit against the governor's Office of Planning and Research, that among Latino families, that younger Latinos, 18 to 34, a very high percentage of them are still living at home, something like 30 or 40%, which is a very high number, just it seems on the surface.
You're exactly right. And of course, things have only gotten worse from COVID. And the further truth is, when housing is a problem, a lot of other things quickly become problems. So again, taking the COVID example, overcrowded housing, multi-generational housing with essential workers has been a hotbed of viral transmission within families, because how do you isolate when you have 2 bedrooms and 1 bath for 6 people? So housing is a big problem, and it's a problem I happen to know a lot about professionally, because what I do is this combination of environmental and land use law, because California alone in the country has made it this environmental battle to even build a single family home, even on an existing lot, or even frankly remodel a single family home, to actually build 200 apartments or even a duplex. If there's anybody at all who wants to stop you, there are myriad ways of interfering with that project, many of which involve laws that I do in my day job when I'm working with clients. So I know a lot about housing law, and I know a lot about environmental law, and I know a lot about the fact that housing right now is the #1 target of our sort of most notorious, although should be grand, environmental law, the California Environmental Quality Act. And that allows, CEQA allows anonymous lawsuits to be filed and to stop projects 2 or 3 years without much effort at all and with virtually no cost. So we have systematically underproduced housing. CEQA is one of the big reasons for it. There are others, but it has reached a true crisis level. And so the California Air Resources Board, under then Governor Jerry Brown, was intent on being a leader on climate change on the global stage. And there were indeed lots and lots of international conferences and stuff that everybody loved to go flying off to. And every few years, the California Air Resources Board is supposed to come up with a blueprint that it calls a scoping plan on how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that occur in California. And that's a sort of weird metric that I'll get into in a second. And in October of 2017, lining up for a December of 2017 approval date, the California Air Resources Board jumped into housing, and not just, cleaning up the grid by endorsing more renewables or battery technology, R&D or whatever, all the stuff that everybody knew CARB was doing, they were doing. But then they also decided to jump in and deal with housing. And they did this in a couple of really, really, really irresponsible ways. The most irresponsible thing they did, which showed just a stunning lack of understanding of the housing market, is decree that most Californians should live in high density elevator buildings along bus routes so that we no longer had to drive and could use transit, and would live in smaller apartments and so consume less energy and not sprawl, their big sort of 5-letter word, out into undeveloped lands, where undeveloped lands can be used for better climate purposes. There's this whole dogma around this idea, and I have to say it's pretty neat if your lifestyle and job and family situation allow you to live in that kind of housing. It's terrific. Housing is one of those things where we need all of it, all of the above. But we literally cannot have a more expensive form of housing to build than high density infill elevator building housing. It costs 5 to 7 times more to build an 8-story or above apartment or condo structure as it does to build, a 1 or 2-story wood duplex, sure, single family home, whatever it is.
Ranch style home. But if I can interrupt here just for a moment, because I think it's just important to make the context here. So your litigation, the first suit you filed was against the California Air Resources Board.
Yeah, that's right.
And that was focused on the issue of
Housing.
the nexus of housing and climate, and that being and just to be clear too as well, the 200 is a coalition of Latino leaders, and one of their main rallying cries, if I can use that phrase, is about home ownership. And it matters among Latinos because as I recall, the average in California, the some like 60 some odd percent of whites own their homes, but among Latinos, it's about 44%. So I'm just trying to abbreviate or underscore
Sure.
the point here is that this matters for the Latino community in California, matters for people all over the country, but home ownership is a key way of building wealth. And that was one of the, in your 100-page lawsuit, this underscores the entirety of your claims, is that the CARB, if I can just summarize it, CARB's actions and their regulations, which are never approved by the Assembly, are in fact prohibiting or limiting home ownership among Latinos. Is that a fair summary?
Latinos plus Blacks and Asians,
low income Californians,
and frankly, young people. I mean, you can have a pretty solid middle class job, a union job, a teacher, fireman, whatever, and still not afford a home. And that's because we've driven up home prices just too darn high. And CARB's selection of this particular housing typology, high density in an urbanized area that has frequent bus service, is literally the most expensive form of housing anyone could have invented. Those units typically cost in excess of $4,000 a month to rent, and they typically cost in excess of $1 million as a purchase price to the extent they're a condo. So here's CARB saying everybody should live to the extent we possibly can. Everybody should rush into this kind of housing, and it's completely unattainable. What then happened, of course, is CEQA, the tool of choice for people who want to stop change and stop housing, was weaponized further by CARB in its scoping plan, when CARB said not only should we live in this completely unaffordable form of housing, which destroys home ownership opportunities for any median income family, which are now majority minority in California, but for new housing, we should really impose a, quote, net zero GHG greenhouse gas emission threshold of significance, which under CEQA means you mitigate by reducing greenhouse gas in the same amount that your new housing unit would create greenhouse gas. Now, what does that mean? Well, there's some greenhouse gas produced when you construct a home from construction equipment. There's modest, very, very little greenhouse gas now produced when you occupy a home, because we have such terrific energy efficiency standards and appliances and everything else. Very little from occupancy. But then as you occupy the home and use a car to get to work, just like your neighbor, that car has greenhouse gas emissions. And if you think about a house being occupied for 30 or 40 years, what net zero at the front end of housing really means is that we need to calculate all greenhouse gas from construction to occupancy to use, including from car trips of occupants and visitors and vendors and everything else, and load up the cost of housing, the price point of housing, with a mitigation regime that would reduce somewhere greenhouse gas emissions by the amount that the housing product would result in. As though, by the way,
and this takes us to the vehicle miles traveled issue, right?
That's exactly right. That's the third of these.
Which as I see it, and I'm not a lawyer, I don't play one on television, but your both of your lawsuits talk about these issues in parallel, and the transportation being a key part of the affordability of home ownership. And there was I think it's in your second lawsuit, you have a remarkable graphic that shows, it's called the percent for sale housing with monthly payments affordable to median income households. And essentially you just graphed the price, the purchase price and the rental prices of of housing going from Santa Monica to Los Angeles to Ontario to San Bernardino. And in San Bernardino, the price is less than almost a tenth, or about an eighth of what it is in Santa Monica. So you just made a fairly complex housing story simple in a graphic by showing the closer you are in California to the water, to the ocean, the more expensive your house. And so is it fair to summarize your argument in the litigation that because of the way the California Air Resources Board and the other state regulators have implemented climate and energy policy, they are making housing so expensive that even people that live far from the coast can't afford it? Is that a fair summary?
It's pretty darn close. It's the fact is, where people can afford to live, so it's kind of a little bit the inverse. Where people can afford to live, and especially where they can afford to buy a house, is farther away from job centers, which means they have to drive more. And that means the next penalty that CARB imposed, which was this notion of penalizing vehicle miles traveled by requiring that we collectively reduce vehicle miles traveled through this high density transit-oriented form of development, means that we will not, I think in the world of CARB, continue to be building home ownership products east of the coast. And that's true for the Bay Area as well as LA. So, you know, the whole point of this is to really just massively change how it is that Californians are supposed to live. And in particular, as you mentioned, home ownership, which has been the absolute most successful route to middle class of any experiment any civilization has tried in history, to our knowledge. Home ownership had a number of systematically racist government programs in place that prevented insured mortgages or redlining, and did this other stuff. And we think about, oh, that's the old days. But actually, we're more segregated by race today than we were before 1960, according to, for example, a UC Berkeley study. And that segregation has to do with price, with housing prices. Okay, so now we have not just more expensive housing in Santa Monica, but a much wider population in Santa Monica. As you go east, the ethnicity of those locations that are lower cost tilts much more toward Latino and Black families, and less wealthy Asian families.
Shown in the graphic that you
exactly
in your lawsuit. And by the way, if you're interested, people are listening, go to the 200.org. You can find a copy of the lawsuit against CARB there. That's the 200 spelled out, all in letters, the 200.org. But you even in your graphic, you show the Latino and African American populations increasing again the further the housing stock is away from saltwater, essentially, or the ocean.
That's pretty much right. That's exactly right. So
if I can interrupt, just so you had. I'm trying to get to the punchline here. You had to sue CARB in order to get relief. I mean, let's get to what's your we've outlined the problem pretty well. Long time ago, a lawyer said, well, when you're looking at these lawsuits, you look at what's the prayer for relief. What are they asking for? So what's the solution here amidst this skein of regulations that are being implemented? What do you want? What's the cure?
We want CARB to get out of the housing siting business where houses should go. We want them to get out of the anti-home ownership business, which is part of actually sort of an anti-capitalist kind of thing. Homeowners have, the recent data, 88 times more wealth than renters. We don't recall anybody in the legislature voting that California should end home ownership, attainable home ownership, and yet that's what CARB has done. So we want them to focus on other ways of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which are not exactly hard to find. And in fact, homes, and California homes, new homes in particular, are so energy efficient. We're making our vehicle fleet so much more energy efficient. The idea that we go after the two most foundational issues to the health of a family and a community, housing and transportation, and we put a bright spotlight on attainable home ownership in affordable locations and say, we have to stop that. We have to stop that for sure. That to me is simply dogma, not policy, certainly not policy justified on a global greenhouse gas emission scale. So we've asked CARB to rescind those measures.
You're asking for CARB to rescind them, or you're asking for an injunction. You also sought an injunction in the other
So that's
litigation.
the third lawsuit. Let me quickly go through each lawsuit. I spent all the time on the CARB lawsuit because it's really the foundational piece. We want CARB to focus on other than transportation and housing in reducing Californians' access to upward mobility, especially communities of color. The other two lawsuits are easier. The second one, we had to file a lawsuit under the Public Records Act because several of the other agencies that worked with CARB chose to conceal documents that were public. I'm pleased to report that we won that lawsuit, which is great. We are getting those documents, and we'll see what they say.
When was that decision? It's been a while since we've been
September.
in touch.
Just okay. September, and then we had
3 months ago.
We had a whole bunch of COVID-related delays. Then there was a third lawsuit because one of the agencies involved used the CARB scoping plan, and specifically the CARB edict in that plan that we should reduce vehicle miles traveled, and they rolled it directly into CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. In regulations adopted in the closing hours of the Brown administration in 2018. One of those CEQA regulations calls for an assessment of vehicle miles traveled in new housing, among other places, and says unless you can be 15% lower than an area average, either a city average, or if you're in a county plus all the incorporated cities average, unless you're 15% below that, you have a significant VMT impact that has to be mitigated. The mitigation for VMT is reducing somebody else's driving somewhere, and nobody knows quite how to make that happen, although certainly there are transportation agencies that are looking to assess fees on new housing to help subsidize transit operations, which in an age of COVID is pretty far-fetched to begin with. So what we sought there is that VMT regulation was slated to go into effect 18 months after the regs. So it would have gone into effect in July of this year. We all, I think, support the notion that people who want to live in denser locations that aren't really set up for transit, cars, to not have to continue to build more roads and stuff for cars. If you choose in a location to make a more walkable community or focus more on transit, like downtown Sacramento, for example, then the last thing you want to do is tear down a bunch of stuff and make more roads. So a VMT metric in transit-served neighborhoods, which is what the legislature actually called for, is fine. But most of California has no transit service, even though those areas that do have transit service, we had more people working from home before COVID than used public transit in the whole Southern California area. Our transit system was never designed for our kind of dispersed employment and housing circumstances. So people use cars, they have to. And in fact, car use has increased every time there's been a population increase and an economic increase. There's been an increase in the amount of miles driven, even as emissions have fallen because we have cleaner cars.
So that third lawsuit is the one this is the 200 versus the governor's office of planning and research, if memory serves.
That's
right?
Exactly right.
And you were seeking an injunction on the implementation of the VMT rules that were supposed to take effect in July of 2020.
That's right. And we got caught in COVID. We were filing in February, COVID hit. We got stuck in a variety of judicial delays. Venue was switched to Sacramento from San Bernardino. So by the time our injunction petition was heard, the regulation was already in effect. And the judge, I think, rightly decided that taking a regulation away is different than just preserving the status quo. So a preliminary injunction kind of preserves the status quo, and we had lost that window because of COVID. What was interesting, though, during that this past summer of COVID, is there were two competing letters issued by groups of legislators. There was a bipartisan group, very diverse ethnic group, pleading with Governor Newsom to delay implementation of this VMT regime, because the housing crisis just got worse during COVID. Our housing prices continued to escalate. There was a rent moratorium, but the fact is we still are in a complete crisis, and now people have less money and a lot fewer jobs. So there was a letter from this bipartisan group, all inland. None of the districts of the signers of this letter touched saltwater, saying, please, not now. None of us are ready for what do we do here. Rural counties can't figure out what to do generally. And even urbanized areas have no ability to deal with this. And I'll give you a quick example in a minute. And then there was a competing letter signed by almost entirely white, much wealthier, all Democrat, coastal legislators saying, no, we have to do this right away. We have to do this right away, this notion of increasing housing costs to mitigate for VMT, for driving the exact same number of miles as your next door neighbor. I want to just make this quick point. So under this VMT regime, if you put a new 3 homes next to an existing 3 homes, you'd think, okay, well, maybe we can think about trying to get those new 3 homes to drive 15% less than the existing 3 homes. Not clear how we would do it, but that's not the test. Say those 3 homes are in unincorporated San Diego County. Well, those 3 homes that are new have to drive about 15% less than the county plus the city. And the city, of course, has transit. So actually, that new home would have to drive about 40% less than their next door neighbor. Now, you just don't make transportation decisions at a lot by lot basis. You use transportation options that are available in the area. You can't manufacture a transit line for 3 new homes.
Sure.
And in fact, you can't manufacture a transit line even for the existing homes, or they would have had one. So it's really a huge impediment. And depending on how you calculate mitigation, it's between $40,000 and $400,000 per unit, per housing unit, if you actually apply this regime as it's written.
And this is the part that in reading over your lawsuit and then talking with some of your colleagues, including John Gamboa, who's based in Oakland and has been a Latino activist for many years, Robert Apodaca, who I've had on the Power Hungry podcast, both talked about this issue and about a time when, and this is the part, now I live in Texas, I'm raised in Oklahoma, but where it goes full crazy town. And I think, okay, California deserves all of it. You know, they deserve all of the derision from other states when you're allowing the implementation of a new regulation that dramatically increases the cost of housing at a time when your housing crisis is already legendary. And that's the part that to me stands out amidst all of this, that at a time
there's one more, but
okay, go ahead. Well, fire away.
It's really harsh to say it, but this is such a fundamentally racist policy. Why? Well, we all know even the CARB website has this cool thing called the calculator, that wealth equates to carbon. A family with 3 homes and a private jet is going to have a much higher carbon footprint than a family barely making mortgage payments and working 3 jobs and having 2 cars. We know that there are plenty of things we can do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but targeting the most regressive of those things, basic shelter, housing, upward mobility through homeownership, basic transportation, cleanest cars in the country. These have a totally racist cast because they hit working families the hardest. There's no progressivism built into this. If we were being progressive about it, we would take drafty, uninsulated Beverly Hills mansions and say, make those greenhouse gas efficient. Our first priority is to take our existing housing stock and squeeze another X amount of greenhouse gas out of that. That would dwarf, by the way, any reasonable program like that would dwarf the kinds of reductions we're seeing from the housing policy, because what's happening under the housing policy, we're just not building much housing. I mean, all we're doing is depopulating. And that's the last thing I want to.
And it's being further constrained by these new regulations that are
Oh,
adding
that's right.
yet higher costs.
That's right.
To starter homes, which would many of them be starter homes for low income young families, et cetera.
Yeah, and I guess that's another piece is, you know, when we talk to Mary Nichols,
the chairwoman of CARB, the
exactly
outgoing chairwoman of CARB,
and by the way, passed over head of US EPA based on objections to her record on environmental justice, but in particular civil rights and race. She was, you know, she looked at these at my clients, civil rights activists to a person, and said, no, we care about your communities. We're going to provide, you know, affordable housing. We're going to help fund affordable housing. And they said, well, you know, that's rental housing, Mary. You know, it's not like we don't appreciate the money, but you're talking about building more projects. And we spent our entire careers trying to get out of projects and into home ownership. And she had no response to that. And you know, the media likes to think about low income, so affordable housing, but affordable rental housing is not the solution for working families who in every other state can still buy a home. We need to restore that attainable home ownership goal as an express policy of California. And people who are pursuing other goals, including greenhouse gas reduction, can squeeze other sectors. But let's be frank about what happens and how this whole regime is set up in terms of metrics. California only measures greenhouse gas in our world, in our California boundaries. So when a family moves to Texas, where per capita GHG emissions are more than double what they are in California, we count that in California as a greenhouse gas reduction. Go ahead, leave. Take your job, take your family.
And a fair amount of Californians are leaving and they're coming to Austin.
Well, that's exactly right. And yet, from a global greenhouse gas perspective, we should instead be saying, stay. Your greenhouse gas profiling, if you stay in California, is lower than it would be in Texas. We're going to encourage you to stay. But no, that's another part of the dogma is, you know, small is beautiful, Buddhist economics, and the whole
Buddhist economics? I've not heard that phrase before. What does that mean?
Oh, there's a really seminal book called Small is Beautiful.
Oh, sure. Yeah. E.F. Schumacher, published in 1971 or
exactly. Yeah. Well, Bill McKibben, a climate activist, did the intro to the new version. But one of the chapters is called Buddhist Economics. And it's this notion of economic well-being redefined through a sort of individual wellness lens. And
the happiness quotient or something, right? That was,
Right. So I see the smirk. I understand the smirk, but you need to know that movement has never died. And in fact, it's now very much part of the climate movement, because there's a whole part of the climate movement that just says, we can't have prosperity anymore. We can't have 24/7 electricity. We all need to work with less and rebalance the planet. And, you know, if you're happy and you have enough food and you have a place to stay when it's, you know, rainy, then you should be happy. That should be enough.
You shouldn't want any more.
That's right.
And I want to reach back to what you said earlier, which it stuck with me, because there's something here. And we've spoken on the phone a few times before in the last few months. But you earlier said that we collectively reduce, and there is afoot in California some, I have to say exactly what it is, a kind of a socialist collectivist agenda now with, you live in Berkeley. Berkeley was the first city in the country to ban the use of natural gas. Well, so I like cooking with gas in my kitchen, right? But now the move is afoot to collectively say, no, you may not. And that that seems to underpin a lot of this. And you even mentioned it before. You said that there is an anti-capitalism underpinning in some of this. Can you talk about that? Because you also said, I'm looking back at my notes from an interview we had a while back. You said this is a climate first agenda. It's not a people first agenda. It's not equity first. It's not safety first. It's not health first. It's climate first and only, which smacks of this collectivist. No, you're going to be happy with what you have, and we're not going to let you have the house because that's not good for you or us. But it smacks a little bit, frankly, of some kind of totalitarian kind of regime. I mean, how do you respond to that?
Well, I respond like, depending on, what the stats you're seeing, 70-80% of the country think the far left and the far right should both go to like New Zealand and fight it out for a few years and leave the rest of us alone. But there is, without question, a far left that, truly does have a variety of values that are quite different than what I'll call sort of fundamental or traditional America and even California values. Having a kid, right? Do you have a kid or do you not have a kid? There's support groups for people who don't have kids because of climate. And that's a pretty amazing life decision to make because of climate. We also have, of course, now much healthier environmental conditions. We certainly are nowhere near perfect, but our air is better, our water's better, our health is better, our longevity by and large, when we're not, driving people to deaths of despair, is better. But all of that betterness leaves those who need to have a crisis to wake up in the morning without a crisis. And so it seems like climate is in many ways fairly abstract. It's either 12 years away, everything's going to fall apart, or 50 years away, or 200 years away, but it's not like the hurricane yesterday, which is more urgent. And so climate gives people a sense of working toward this long-term goal with this urgency and righteousness that exactly says you need to get past the idea that you should be able to choose a gas stove, or that you should have reliable and backup power sources, not just one power source.
Or have a car that you like, or buy a pickup.
Yeah,
or an F-150.
right.
No, you can't have an F-150. You have to have an EV of some kind, because
that's exactly right. So then we put in place, and this is of course after the lawsuits are in play, but COVID. So what happens with COVID? Well, people flee elevator buildings, people flee transit, people start working from home. So interestingly, guess what? If you work from home, you're not driving to work every day. Now that only works for a segment, obviously, of the workforce to have that remote work option.
And
but
what did you call them? The keyboard class? Wasn't that what?
Yeah. The keyboard economy.
The keyboard economy. Yeah, right.
But working from home is a really solid way of reducing peak hour commutes, which is the worst, right? That's when people are stuck for hours and emissions go up just because trips have to be so much longer because we haven't built any capacity. But it turns out that working from home is detested by this climate dogma because it allows people to move further out and still be in single family homes with private backyards. And it turns out that that's what people have gravitated toward during the pandemic, whether they stay in California but leave San Francisco.
And it seems like that trend will, once it's started now, will only continue. People, I don't have to do that. And so there's a whole shift going on in terms of, I think, some of the thinking about real estate. But let me back up for a moment, Jennifer. And again, my guest is Jennifer Hernandez. She is a lawyer for the 200. and the lead litigator on several lawsuits now, 2 lawsuits that are still ongoing against the state of California over their energy and climate policies. So, but you're running straight at the climate orthodoxy in arguably one of the furthest left states in America, the biggest economy of any state in the country. But you're also taking on, and I have to ask this question because of we talked about the natural gas bans. Those are being promoted avidly by the Sierra Club, and you are fighting against effectively the dogma that's being promoted by 2 of the most powerful environmental groups in the state of California, the Natural Resources Defense Council and Sierra Club. So when you think about those groups, how do you perceive them now? Because you're effectively not just doing battle with the state and the state regulators, but these powerful environmental groups that have a lot of sway over regulations that are occurring now at both the state and the city level. I'm speaking specifically about the gas bans. How do you feel about those groups and the people that are leading them?
Well, so that's another part of my biography that I did not share, but I spent 23 years as a board member of the California League of Conservation Voters, which inside California has the stature of the Sierra Club and NRDC in terms of its political profile. And we endorsed candidates and wanted to make sure that the environment was high on everyone's radar screen, and actually that public health and specifically public health for disadvantaged communities was also considered an environmental issue. That happened on my watch. I was the longest serving minority member of that board in its history. And many of the people who are part of the other organizations either were members of the CLCV board or part of that circle. So I know these people. And unfortunately, I watched the drift from the mid-'80s when I first got active, where there was still a fair amount of bipartisan support for improving the environment, right? That nobody wanted to live in a bad environment. Then it sort of got a little more partisan, especially as we sort of had to deal with kind of Rust Belt transition issues and what is the role of regulation in driving manufacturing out of the US, and is it cost, or is it, so things got a little trickier. But really over time and up to the end of my tenure, what I perceived is the ethic of the environmental movement kind of unfortunately in full bloom with this kind of, we have too many people. We're just over our holding capacity. We have done fatal harm to Mother Gaia, the earth, and we need to prioritize saving the planet over saving the people. And this VMT regime, for example, was first introduced by Hector de la Torre, I want to say maybe 15 years ago, as a really nifty idea to charge people for how long they drive, to penalize them for driving too far. And too far, of course, was being defined by this kind of urban ethic of a keyboard economy and work in the coffee shop or whatever. And the idea that you would have to drive 180 miles to get to your job was just anathema. They didn't like it. They certainly weren't going to allow housing in their own neighborhoods, God forbid, but they didn't want people driving 180 miles a day either. And so I and another member of the board, the 2 Latinas on the board, we had no African Americans at the time, were like, what are you talking about? You're putting a target on those least able to pay. You think people are driving 180 miles because they want to? No, it's where they can afford to live, and especially where they can afford to buy a home. Find another mechanism. And to a person, everybody was like, no, we have to stop these evil drivers. And it's like, well, those evil drivers are Latino and Black workers. What are you doing? There are young people. What are you doing? And the answer was, unfortunately, environmentalism has a really large strain of its own racism. And this past summer, every environmental organization in the country did a kind of race mea culpa. The philanthropy, which tracks philanthropic organizations generally, has said that the environmental leadership at the board and leadership level is very white and getting whiter. And so the trend line is opposite. Of course, the environmental movement also had a lot in common through its founders with sort of anti-Native American, there's no clear affinity other than this marriage of convenience in the Democratic Party, which I'm a member of, between environmentalists and civil rights activists. Of course, there should be an affinity, but this is like mutually assured destruction.
This is mutually assured destruction. I'm sorry, follow up. What do you mean by that? That
environmentalists disproportionately targeting those who have the least ability to pay for a climate transition is destruction of part of their Democratic Party constituency. It's taking on the working people.
And yet whenever, and I see this when I think the Seattle was the first city, well, I guess Brookline, Massachusetts also implemented a natural gas ban, then was overridden by the state legislature. But invariably, when I read, I think it was the mayor of San Jose and Oakland, when they passed their natural gas bans, there's this reflexive move to mention Black and brown communities that are disadvantaged communities, that we're doing this because they suffer from pollution and therefore getting rid of natural gas will be good for them. Is that by accident? Is this part of the calculus in terms of the effort to co-opt those communities? How do you see there's that rhetoric?
So there's this generalized rhetoric around poor people being hurt the most by, frankly, almost anything, right? If you have a more fragile,
lately about climate change, right? But that's been very much the rhetoric around, oh, well, we have to do this because poor folks are going to get hurt by climate change the most, therefore X, Y, and Z.
Right. And so there are many problems with that overall frame, although, from a global population perspective, no question that we have hugely poor countries that are more at risk from climate change than less poor. So, I mean, I get it. And then there's also sort of, look, people without means are the ones who live in the flood-prone areas because they can't afford to get out. So, fix climate change, avoid floods, help those. Talk about indirect, though, and much more direct is to use a gas heater for your home or your apartment during the winter in California, which gets cold, by the way, especially inland. It gets cold. Using gas is a fraction of the cost of using electricity. And we already have the highest electric rates in the lower 48, and those rates are just going up. And we already have, frankly, supply challenges. And we already use natural gas, by the way, to meet those supply challenges because we don't have
on electricity supplies. Now you're talking
on an electricity supply basis. So it's much more efficient to use a gas stove or a gas heater at the consumer level and spend, frankly, pennies to do what it would take dollars to do with electricity, instead of using, quote, electricity at night, which is just natural gas delivered through the grid, as opposed to a natural gas heater. So it's a very convoluted attack, but it's an attack that is really premised on needing to just end fossil fuels. And, I don't know about you, Robert, but at this point in my life, anybody who says you have to do something urgently and it's like this on switch, off switch, it's invariably wrong, right? I mean,
it's a crisis. You forgot it's a crisis. It's all a crisis.
Exactly. Should you migrate toward cleaner technology? Of course. Should you migrate toward more efficient technology? Of course. Should you stop wasteful emissions? Of course. Those are areas of agreement. But right now, we can't find areas of agreement. We just want to be, I think, shouting at each other. It's like the Joan Didion realpolitik, it's more important to shout than it is to actually attain a goal. And that certainly is true for a goal like equity, which is just not on the agenda.
Well, so let me ask you then, so you've talked about the cure, the prayer for relief. Your prayer for relief with the CARB lawsuit is the suspension of CARB's rules on housing. And in the litigation, you won the litigation on the open records, but now you still have the other case pending against the Office of Planning and Research. And
both cases are still pending.
Yeah, both cases are still pending. what are your chances? I'm going to ask a lawyer, what are your chances of success at the courthouse? But I mean, you've made broad constitutional claims here as well, including under equal
We sure
protection
have.
and fair housing, well, or the Federal Housing Act. How does equal protection apply in this case? I'm not a lawyer. I don't pretend to be one. And how does equal protection apply here? And why wouldn't you file? You filed in state court, not in federal court. Why would you go? Why not go to federal court with your constitutional claims and explain why equal protection matters here?
Well, so we have a variety of both state law claims and federal law claims, and the state courts can take cognizance of federal constitutional claims. If we get an adverse ruling in state court, we can also take it to federal court. You know, I did a lot of reading on civil rights litigation, and it's very, very challenging. You know, there were many, many decades of courts upholding separate but equal school systems, saying that's just fine or that's just political. And ultimately, of course, a court decision, Brown versus Board of Education, shot that down. But that result happened over a course of decades, and it happened alongside civil rights protests, but also alongside political awakening and political awareness of this, you know, well, I thought this was, you know, we're the good guys. We thought this would be better for kids' schooling, you know, it would keep the peace between the races or whatever. And all kinds of people defended that status quo until suddenly it seemed ridiculous and abhorrent and shameful. And that's what I think is the arc here.
So if I can interrupt, so you're saying that equal protection, you're making a parallel between equal access to housing as equal access to what the Thurgood to schools, right? Thurgood Marshall argued that case, didn't he? And then later.
Yeah, and what was really, I think, one of the most disheartening moments of my entire career, and I've been at this now 35 years, is the California Attorney General actually tried to dismiss that civil rights claim in our first lawsuit against CARB, saying it was absolutely constitutional for CARB to engage in racially discriminatory housing measures because housing was not a protected class, which was both a total misread of the law, but beyond that, an absolutely stunning thing for a California Attorney General under Javier Becerra, my classmate at Stanford, to put that in writing, not once but twice, to argue it in court in front of Judge Cardoza, that it's okay for CARB to engage in racially exclusionary housing measures. Those words should not have come off of anyone's fingers or lips in California 2 years ago, but they sure did. And that's how blind we have become morally to looking at a mirror in our climate policy making and asking the question, is this really fair? Is it really effective? By denying people the right to actually own a home like they can in the rest of the country and inducing people to leave to Texas, is that really good for the environment? Is it good for the global climate change circumstance? The answer to those questions is no. This is a powerful dogma, really powerful, and it's kind of sexy too. We got the Hollywood stars and everybody excited about climate change and stuff, and they go, you know, to international climate conferences pre-COVID on private jets and, you know, don't wear shoes to show their solidarity with the people. I mean, there's a bunch of nonsense that happens around this stuff, but the truth is we are doing with climate what too often the ruling class, if I could make such a bold statement, does by reflex, and that is coming up with incredibly hurtful and racially discriminatory measures instead of focusing on alternatives where all ships could rise with the tide, or at least everybody who works hard can buy a place and actually have that first rung in the middle class, just like we have in the rest of the country.
Well, you know, you keep mentioning the home ownership part, and we have a mutual friend, Joel Kotkin, and he has a great new book out on the rise of
neo-feudalism.
Neo-feudalism, thank you. But he talked about home ownership in a way that I thought was really compelling. He said, people need a stake. They need a stake in the society, and you get that with a home, right? That if they're all renters, then everybody's kind of disconnected, and they don't, you know, their attachment to the local park or the local highway or, you know, garbage pick, it's not as strong as having an ownership stake.
You know, there are places where I'm sure that's not as accurate, and there are a lot of long-term renters who choose to be rent.
No, fair enough.
But as you're exactly right, as a path for working families to try to create economic and housing security for themselves and for their children, there is nothing like it. I mean, my dad lost his steelworker job at age 56, having never worked anywhere except U.S. Steel. And the fact that they owned their home, my parents owned their home. It was a $21,000 home. It's not a, you know, great home, 900 square feet or something. But that kept them from falling into poverty. The same with my two grandmothers, who each married steel workers as well, and they both had 20-year widowships. It was home ownership that allowed them dignity and, frankly, economic support as they got older. It's just such a core value, and it's the one value that is attainable, truly attainable, to those who can work hard and save with a fair amount of discipline, even if they don't have, you know, a degree in coding. It's a path into a stake for their family, not just the community, but for their family. And people will go 180 miles from their job to create that stake for their family. We owe them, I think, better than this really misbegotten and frankly racist climate policy that California environmentalists have cooked up. It's nonsense.
So this is personal for you.
It is very personal. Yeah, I don't donate time. I charge a lot for my time, except to causes that are extraordinary. And I have had the privilege of working for civil rights leaders in this environmental space. I've had that privilege for 20-some years now.
And you volunteer your time in the hope that you win, and if you win, you get the lawyer fees.
That's right.
But otherwise, this is all a donation for you.
Well, it would certainly be nice if there were donations to the 200, the 200.org for anyone hearing this and feeling like this is a good thing, because we do have costs in addition to foregone fees.
Sure. So do you have co-counsel on this? I'm looking at the pleadings. I see your name. I don't see any others. So you're the one that's carrying the legal battle right to the state regulators on behalf of the 200, which Joe Cotto, John Gamboa, Robert Apodaca,
Herman Gallegos. There's a long list of pretty terrific people, including Don Prada, Sonny McPeak, former cabinet members, former members of the legislature. Because remember, none of this was voted on, right?
And go into that, because that was the part that to me, again, was in talking with both Mr. Apodaca and in our previous conversations, that these rules on vehicle miles traveled, which to me, I mean, of all the things that you're litigating here, this is the one that, you know, if I were British, I would say that's gobsmacking, right? I mean, or forehead smacking, that you're essentially taxing mobility.
That's right.
And to me, a quick side story, I knew a guy in the railroad business a long time ago. He said, without transportation, there's no commerce. And then I made the corollary, well, the transportation depends on oil. And so without oil, there's no commerce. But without transportation, there's no commerce, which means if you don't have effective transportation, you can't work, you can't trade, you can't.
That's right.
There's no way to make that happen. So, but the vehicle miles traveled thing to me, it seems especially pernicious. And the point, getting back to the point here, that 5 hours later, that the legislature, the California Assembly, never voted on this. Not only essentially such a draconian regulation.
So you're wrong. The legislature, which is the Senate and the Assembly, repeatedly voted down regulating VMT. They refused to regulate VMT.
Impose it, right.
So every year someone proposes, we got to reduce VMT, mandate reductions in VMT, use CEQA to mandate reductions in VMT, use climate law, SB 375, to mandate reductions in VMT. Every single time that's come up to the legislature for a real political debate, the answer has been, well, that's absurd. We can clean up cars, we can support transit, we can do things now to, enhance broadband and maybe facilitate more remote work, take some miles off the road that way. But we're not going to be able to mandate reductions in VMT. We just can't. Look at the state. Look at the different circumstances of the state. So the political decision makers have said no. But Jerry Brown and Gavin Newsom,
the administrative state, said yes.
That's right. That's right.
And that seems, again, particularly pernicious here, in that it is not on a vote of the elected. It's a move by the unelected to impose this kind of regulation. So we're at about an hour, and I'd like to keep my interviews at about an hour, because I'm not Joe Rogan. But a couple of quick things. How long do you think it will take to resolve these lawsuits? I mean, these are complex. You make many claims in them. You've had the delays because of COVID. How long do you think it might take to resolve this? Because you really are fighting, as I'm not telling you anything, you're fighting a very difficult battle against a lot of people with a lot of money and a lot of lawyers. How long might this take?
Well, we are, of course, ever hopeful that new decision makers, and we have, for example, a new head of CARB, will take a look at this and say, I get it. Okay, I get it. I understand. And we're going to not have those provisions in our next scoping plan, which is due in another year and a half. The state has been doing rope-a-dope. They've been filing motions. They've been delaying production of documents. They've done what they can do to drag these out, and that's the nature of litigation. So we'll fight them as long as there's fight in me. We'll continue to fight them, and if others would like to help, we'd certainly love getting some help, in kind, whatever we can get. We would love to get some more help, but it's too important. It's too important to just say to these agency people who are not elected, yeah, go ahead and eliminate mobility, eliminate home ownership. Go ahead, it doesn't matter, because you guys are older and whiter and you have yours. And so what we do to the kids in the name of climate, and you
live near the coast.
Exactly. Yeah. I live in Berkeley. Heating and air conditioning is a matter really of opening and closing windows. I mean, it's really not that challenging most of the time. So if your entire worldview is based on cities like Berkeley, then, it's not just the country you're not in tune with, you're not even in tune with the state. Drive 50 miles. And I'm guessing most of these folks have not driven 50 miles. They may fly 5,000 miles, but they're not going to be, visiting Riverside.
They're not going to visit rural San Bernardino County or Bakersfield,
exactly.
but they will vacation in Bali. When was the last time you were back to your hometown in Pittsburgh, California?
Oh, just a couple of weeks ago, actually. We still have family there. My parents met when they were in junior high. And so we're longtime residents, Mexican and Italian.
And what do your folks think about the loss? You've told them, you've briefed your folks on this.
Yeah.
What did
we lost my dad, unfortunately. My mother frets. She's always fretted. Are you sure you're up for this battle? And I'm like, well, Mom, and then she's like, yeah, it's what you've always done.
I have a pretty good day job, Mom. So.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
but I have to say, you don't break out of Pittsburgh with a full ride scholarship to Harvard because you say yes and thank you. There are other forces have to be at work to find that path. I didn't quite know what I was doing then. Hopefully, I do now.
So, who do you admire? You've been in the legal business. Any lawyers you admire? Who are your heroes?
Well, I mean, John Gamboa is one for sure, and Herman and Joe and Robert.
And John Gamboa has his organization is Community Builders. Is that?
California Community Builders was an experiment that he and Robert did to see if they could build affordable housing, and they learned by doing just all of the unbelievable hurdles we put in the way of that activity. From a regulatory perspective, which is why they started then the 200.
And Community Builders has done an excellent video. I remember watching it. It's on YouTube on CEQA and the problems with California Environmental Quality Act and how it stands in the way of more affordable housing. And so
Yeah,
anyway, I
yeah,
just wanted to
yeah.
interject that.
Yeah, thanks so much. Appreciate it. But they're definitely heroes. My view of heroism is a little more mundane. I think, my dad, for example, who weathered a whole bunch of setbacks, and just held it together, and was always, and he and my mom always had our backs, which is a pretty amazing thing for parents to give to kids. I think for all of those parents, especially in this incredibly challenging year with kids at home and stuff, those are my heroes. Those are the people I would like to go down helping.
Yeah.
So
So what are you reading? What books are you?
Oh gosh,
You a book reader, newspaper reader? What's on the
yeah,
nightstand or the office stand, or what do you read?
I'm a pretty voracious media reader. A lot of that is happening.
So news and magazines.
Yeah, about 4 years ago now, I read Color of Law, which is a book about residential development racism, redlining practices over the years. And Richard Rothstein has become a friend. And that has set me off in a whole bunch of other kind of civil rights history reading. And it's shocking to me how pernicious this movement is. Although this movement that is to just be blindly but seriously and constantly racially discriminatory is a pretty tough pill to swallow, even as all these organizations now are all looking for the perfect Black veteran with a Latina wife and to create some color diversity on their boards or leadership ranks. The truth is they're not open to policy self-examination.
So is this John Gamboa, I think, used this term. We've talked about, and again, my guest is Jennifer Hernandez, a lawyer for the 200. He used the term climate redlining, that all of these policies regarding vehicle miles traveled, regarding home ownership and energy and climate policies are in California he has been very involved in redlining and the issue of not the refusal of banks and other lenders to give money to Blacks and Latinos who want to buy in white neighborhoods or Anglo neighborhoods. Is all of this in some climate redlining?
Yeah, it is. It's a continuum.
Is that the best term? Is that the best phrase?
I think it's a pretty good one. I think you've just coined it. You or John. There's been some even, climate apartheid was used by another person. And that apartheid concept includes that spatial divide, where Marin is
the separation and the segregation.
Yeah, it's sundown towns, right? There's no more workers left in town at sundown because they just they're not allowed to live there. And we have that all over coastal California.
Last question, what gives you hope?
Oh, you know what? The truth is, I think people are more sensible than politicians give them credit for. I don't, I couldn't be farther away from Trump, the personality, but anyone who ignored the concerns of people who voted for him and the concerns about far left policies, does so at their peril. Same thing on the other side is folks on the religious right that we don't talk about much anymore, who wanted to be effectively legislating what happens in my bedroom. That was not acceptable either. So I think we're on a far left swing of the pendulum, and Biden is not exactly a far left candidate. So he's got his hands full. But I am hoping that we can begin to speak about this stuff because the coverage of climate policy making is pretty laudatory and unquestioning by most mainstream media. And I think it came as a huge shock that Mary Nichols wasn't, the CARB leader wasn't the hero to, minority Californians, communities of color, that she was largely perceived to be by, white environmentalists and the media who write about them. So
Well,
I
if
do
I can
think we need
interrupt,
more open
and,
media.
you gave a great summary about what gives you hope, but I did want to ask that one other part of it, because this is the I've been in journalism about as long as you've been doing legal business. Never had a real job, but the coverage of climate issues in general, and the way the coverage has skewed toward favoring anything having to do with renewables, favoring anything having to do with the environmental groups that are pushing them, and opposed to the hydrocarbon sector, opposed to any discussion about whether it's existential crisis and all the rest of it. It is remarkable, and I see it particularly in the Los Angeles Times, this kind of unquestioned kind of, oh, well, anyone who might speak out against this, and even Robert Apodaca is held up for not even ridicule would be too strong a word, but very circumspect, very questioning of the motives and so on. That is not. I don't want to keep you all day, but this to me is a really important question. Is from why is the media so skewed against even the coverage of your litigation? I'm not patting myself on the back, but I'm one of the few who's covered it in any detail.
Yeah.
It's remarkable. Why is that?
I think we have lost a lot of media over the past few years, right? As the world has consolidated and daily newspaper staffs have obviously shrunk to nothing. I think there's a little entropy there. If minority coverage is affordable, deed restricted rental housing or crime, and those are the two things that you cover when you cover people who are Black or brown, and somebody has to step out and say, well, what else, right? And then we don't have so much of the what else. Probably to me, one of the more discouraging features of the media is as the YIMBY movement, yes, in my backyard, a pro-housing group of largely white millennials kind of took hold, then that became kind of a media darling too, because so many of the reporters shared those same demographics. But it's this notion of this unconscious bias, right? That most people have, and in this era of Black Lives Matter and racial awakening, it doesn't seem like there's been too much of an appetite to say it's not just a question of the color of the people around the table, but it's what are we doing at the table. That transition has not happened, and I wish it would. But it's now, as you say, wrapped around anti-capitalism, a whole sort of, we just need to be more dictatorial about what we tell people they can and can't do. And by the way, that's new people who aren't already here, because we don't have the gumption to tell people already here what they can do or not do, to the extent they're wealthier donors or homeowners. So it's a pretty, the media coverage situation is pretty discouraging, and I'm grateful for folks like you and others who pick up the baton and talk about it. Energy in particular is hard to get covered well. The whole idea of where exactly are we getting enough electricity to power the transportation sector? Are you serious?
Sure.
We can't even power our current sector. We can't keep manufacturers because we charge too much for energy. It's just cheaper to be somewhere else.
Well, those are good summaries. As I say it, expensive energy is the enemy of the poor, and yet this is there's a lot.
And the Sierra Club agreed with you for quite a few years. There's a very noteworthy quote that said, environmental protectionism depends on clean, cheap energy, and that's true. It was a Sierra Club president speaking in favor of nuclear energy at the time. Since been disavowed in favor of the sort of slow growth, small is beautiful. But there was once a time when environmental values were not taken to such extremes that they create division instead of collaboration. And I'd like to get back to that.
Well, it's been a great conversation, Jennifer. My guest, Jennifer Hernandez, she's a partner at Holland and Knight, a very large law firm. She's also the lead lawyer for the 200 coalition of Latino groups who are involved in some very important litigation in California that's ongoing and will be for, I'm going to guess, a couple years at least before you get it resolved. But it's been a pleasure to have you. If you want to follow up on Jennifer's work, go to the200.org. That's all spelled out. No numerals there, the200.org. Jennifer, any other thoughts you want to just throw in here the last moment?
Thank you. Thank you for the work you do. Thanks for your audience for putting up with this long interview, and have a great 2021.
All right, great. Thanks. Very many thanks to you, Jennifer. Thanks to all of you in podcast land. If you like this one, give us a positive rating on your favorite podcast outlet, and I will see you next time on the Power Hungry Podcast.